First of all, I would like to thank Micronutrient for inviting me to come to warm Arizona and to give a presentation on transition cow management. The topic of my presentation is a focus on carbohydrate nutrition during a calving transition. I like to define what I mean by transition period. It is made of 3 weeks before calving, which is called as close-up period, and 3 weeks immediately after calving, which is called fresh period. Then it is very important time for nutritional management because fresh cow, we tend to have more problem. Although their intake is not high, their nutrient requirement increase drastically, and they experience more metabolic disorders and complications. Then this is the data from one cow in my research farm at University of Alberta, and the change in dry matter intake before and after calving. Well, this cow increased dry matter intake steadily after calving, and it reached 23 kilo of dry matter intake within 4 days after calving. But not all animals respond this positively. And some cows, like 11-17, well, she didn't increase dry matter intake, and she suffered from metabolic complications after calving. So how can we help these animals who are at a greater risk of metabolic disorders? Well, this presentation, I like to cover these topics: optimizing starch content in close-up diet, and fresh cow diet, and feeding sugars during the calving transition period, and role of forage in fresh cow diet, and some management factor affecting animal response and take-home messages. So one thing I like to emphasize throughout my presentation is that, for example, fresh period is not a standalone period, but is a part of transition period. Likewise, close-up period is not a standalone period, but it's a part of transition period. So we need to think about the flow of nutritional management when we discuss what's good and what optimum for fresh cow management and close-up cow management. So with that, I like to talk specific thing about optimizing starch content in close-up diets. Well, in this area, there are different ideas and recommendations, sometimes conflicting to each other. Then I like to give some explanation or physiological mechanism for each idea or recommendation. Then, well, this slide shows the change in energy requirement from late lactation to early lactation. As you can see here, well, after at the dry off, energy requirement of animals decrease drastically because they don't produce milk. Then I think most standard approach to feed this animal is to just meet their energy requirement, as indicated by a red color. Okay? So this is most standard approach, and which makes sense. But this is associated with great risk of rumen acidosis right after calving, because this approach requires sudden change in diet from high forage dry cow diet to high grain lactation diet. So it increases the risk of rumen acidosis, and recent research shows that, well, maybe LPS, lipopolysaccharide, and toxin can be released from the gut, and it causes inflammation, systemic inflammation. Then the requirement for energy to deal with inflammation, well, maybe reduce the energy available for milk production, then decrease milk production. So to avoid this kind of complication right after calving, well, maybe from a pure ruminal perspective, well, extremely speaking, this kind of approach, no change in diet energy content would be maybe good, although it's not realistic from a ruminal perspective, because rumen microbe does not like sudden change in diet fermentability. But this is, as I said, it's not realistic approach. About 20 years ago, dairy NRC introduced the concept of feeding, close-up diet to adapt rumen and rumen microbe to a highly fermentable diet to be fed after calving. So, yeah, this approach was proposed. So, this, concept of feeding high-starch close-up diet had a lot of advantages in terms of adapting rumen, microbe, and ruminal epithelial cells to lactation diet, and it helped smooth transition to highly fermentable lactation diets. But more recent research, we found that there are many disadvantages of feeding high-starch close-up diet before calving. Well, it increased fat deposition, and also it caused insulin resistance. Then this slide shows the relationship between a body condition score and mesenteric adipose mass. Okay. So when researchers fed high-energy diet, well, this solid line shows a relationship between body condition score and visceral fat mass. Okay. Then there is one point I like to make from this slide. Well, even with optimum body condition score at calving, for example, 3.5, there are huge variation in internal fat. Well, some cows have only 5 kilo or 7 kilo of mesenteric fat, but some have close to 30 kilo of mesenteric fat at same body condition score. So if we feed a lot of energy to dry cow, some cow may get fat, but some cow may not get fat. But what we see, from outside, we are evaluating body condition score, which is just a subcutaneous fat. Then what affects metabolism of fresh cows, transition cows, is more caused by mesenteric fat. So so body condition score alone does not tell us exact, the damage that might be caused by feeding excess energy during the dry period. Another research that I like to show is done at University of Illinois. The researcher evaluated 3 different nutritional management protocols. First one is feeding high-starch diet throughout the dry period, and the other one is feeding low-starch diet 15% throughout dry period, and the other one is the far-off period 15% and close-up period 20%. It is more representing more like a close-up, like a steam-up diet. Then this slide, I'm showing that the change in plasma ketone concentration, and x-axis is days after calving. So when you feed a high-starch diet throughout dry period, it actually increases ketone concentration after calving, and it, but when you feed low-starch diet throughout the dry period, it helps animal maintain low ketone concentration after calving. Then, well, you may think that just feeding a high-starch diet for 3-week period, just close-up period, would not cause that kind of severe problem. But obviously, the data shows that ketone concentration is higher than cows fed low starch diets throughout the dry period. So again, while animal may not be obese by feeding a high energy diet just for 3-week period, but obviously metabolism is affected negatively by feeding a high starch, high energy diet during the dry period. So this slide kind of summarizes how prepartum excess energy intake affects metabolism negatively after carving. Well, it causes depression in dry matter intake and mobilized body fat. Then some of them are deposited in the liver, causing fatty liver. Then it decreases hepatic metabolic capacity. Then I would say that this is also decreased dry matter intake further, and it causes a negative spiral of transition period. Okay. Then other thing I like to explain is insulin resistance. Well, insulin resistance, well, regardless of how fat animals are, well, it cause excess mobilization of body fat. Okay. Then I like to explain briefly what about insulin resistance is. Well, usually insulin act on adipose tissue and trying to reduce fat mobilization and reduce NEFA. But animal, when they experience insulin resistance, adipose tissue do not respond to signal of insulin. Then as a consequence, adipose tissue continue to mobilize a lot of fat. Then beyond the capacity for the mammary gland to take up, then it is taken up by the liver, and it causes great oxidative metabolism, which leads to reduction in intake, and also it increases fatty liver and ketosis problems. So insulin resistance is another negative consequence caused by feeding excess energy during the dry period. So, so it delays dry matter intake recovery after carving, and it increases metabolic complications. So from a pure metabolic perspective, it is better to feed low energy, controlled energy diet throughout the dry period. But again, well, as I indicated 10 minutes ago, well, animal needs to suffer, right at the carving if we go with this approach. Okay. Then more recently, we are talking about what we can do during a fresh period. So if I were a dairy producer, I would probably feed a controlled energy, low energy diet throughout the dry period, but I still see the point of adapting rumen to highly fermentable lactation diet. So I would consider using a fresh period for ruminal adaptation. Okay. So this is just a kind of brief overview of our current understanding during the close-up management. But I'd like to show some recent data that was published on Journal of Dairy Science. Well, this is a research report from Finland, Northern Europe. They feed the primary forage source there is grass silage instead of corn silage. Then they found some different result. Well, dry cow management, when they feed, okay, well, control energy intake, they use wheat straw 40%. Then high energy intake, well, it's just ad libitum access of grass silage, a high quality grass silage. Then it results over like 140% of energy requirement. Okay, so when they provide additional energy from forage fiber, highly digestible grass silage instead of wheat straw, well, greater energy intake did not cause adverse effect or no insulin resistance and no body fat mobilization after calving. Then actually the energy status was better, then milk production was better when they get greater energy from grass silage before calving. So this is different from what we typically found in diet made of corn silage. Another discrepancy recently reported is the grazing system. Well, the recent study published 2015 to 2018, well, in grazing system, controlled energy intake benefit cow with adequate good body condition score, but they reported excess energy intake help thinner cows. Okay, so these data indicate well, not all animals responded negatively to excess energy intake before calving, and these discrepancy can be attributed to the difference in body condition score at dry off, and maybe a different approach to provide additional energy. Does it, or forage replaced by grain, or does, is wheat straw replaced by high quality forage? I think these, difference in among experiment may explain the different outcome. Then other thing I want to point out is the difference in nutritional management after calving. Okay, as I said earlier, optimum close-up management is affected by what kind of management we provide after calving. Okay, with that, I like to switch gear and I like to talk about starch, optimizing starch content and starch source during a fresh period. Well, first of all, I like to show 4 research data that evaluated starch content of fresh period. Well, just to tell you the conclusion, well, 2 of 4 studies reported feeding high starch fresh diet is better for animal. But the other 2 said low starch fresh diet is better for fresh cows. Then I like to spend some time to talk about what makes the difference in animal response. Okay, but first of all, this is a study done at Cornell University, and they evaluated a high starch versus low starch diet, 26 and 21%. Then both dry matter intake and milk yield was greater for cows fed high starch diet. Okay. Then this is a study done at Michigan State University. Then they also evaluated high starch, low starch. Then they reported dry matter intake was greater by 2 kilo for cows fed high starch diet. Then milk fat content was lower, but I think this is a good reason because, well, cows fed high starch diet reduce their body weight loss. So it means that less fat mobilization and less milk fat is produced. But I think it reflects a better energy status of cows fed high starch diet. So these 2 studies show that positive response to high starch diet. But this study, this is a report from Netherlands. They fed, well, they don't have fixed starch content because they change, concentrate feeding over time. And low starch diet, well, they increase concentrate feeding 0.25 kilo per day. And they take 40 days to increase their grain allocation, concentrate allocation to the maximum level of 10 kilo per day. But high starch diet, it's more like a rapid adaptation to high grain diet. They increase concentrate allocation 1 kilo per day. Then they took only 10 days to get to the maximum level of 10 kilo per day. So I cannot give you specific starch content in this study because it keeps changing. But it's obvious that rapid adaptation, rapid increase is associated with greater starch content. But it's interesting. You can see, milk production data there. Low starch diet increased milk production by like 4 kilo per day, which is interesting. And this is a study that we conducted at University of Alberta. We fed, high starch, low starch diet. Then, although we didn't see any difference in dry matter intake, we found similar result, like a 4 kilo greater milk production response for cows fed low starch diet compared to high starch diet. Okay, so 2 studies shows positive response with high starch diet, and the other 2 studies shows positive response with low starch diet. Then in this slide, I highlight starch content that was associated with great animal response with blue font. Okay, so as I said, 2 and 2 shows opposite result. Then I'd like to spend some time to think about what caused this difference in animal response. One thing I noticed among these 4 studies, well, the difference in starch content during the close-up period. So the study that shows more positive response to high starch diet in fresh period, animals were fed high starch diet during the close-up period. And then study that shows a more positive response with low starch diet, the animals were fed low starch diet before calving. Okay, so I think one of the speculation I had is maybe combination of high starch fresh diet and low starch control energy close-up diet may increase risk of SARA right after calving, and probably it reduces intake, energy intake, and milk yield, or even with similar dry matter intake, maybe systemic inflammation cause more energy wasted for non-productive purpose. I think like a recent study done by Lance Bonger lab at Iowa State showed that inflammation or immune system require a lot of energy. So I think systemic inflammation might be associated with a greater energy requirement. Okay. Other thing I noted in these 4 studies are primary starch source, difference in primary starch source in fresh cow diet. Okay, the 2 studies that showed positive response to high starch diet, they fed dry ground corn. But the study who shows negative response to high starch diet, the primary grain, primary starch source was barley and wheat. Okay, barley and wheat are way more fermentable than corn. So I think type of grain we feed after calving may affect animal response to fresh cow diet. Then related to this, I found interesting study reported from Michigan State. This was published late last year. Then they did, experiment 2x2 factorial arrangement of treatment, 2 levels of starch content, and 2 types of starch source, dry ground corn and high moisture corn. Then dry ground corn in vitro 7-hour digestibility, starch digestibility was 44%, but high moisture corn 62%. So you can see the difference in starch availability between those 2 grains source. Then this is the result. Well, first of all, the black line indicates the animal response of cows fed dry ground corn, and gray line indicates animal response fed high moisture corn. So the p-value was highly significant. Yeah, sorry about that. Okay. So the cows fed dry ground corn increased dry matter intake compared with cows fed high moisture corn. And the interaction was tendency P equal 0.07. So if you compare solid black line with solid gray line, you see the huge difference in dry matter intake. Then dry ground corn, which is less fermentable, help fresh cow increase dry matter intake after calving. Then this is milk production response. Cows fed dry ground corn increase milk yield right after calving. So it's interesting. Well, more fermentable diet should provide more energy, but speaking about fresh cows, they responded more positively to diets that contains less slowly fermentable starch source. So, so these are the recent study we found in the literature. Then there are different approach to reduce starch content. Many studies use high fiber byproduct to reduce starch content of fresh cow diet, but I found 2 studies use sugars to replace starch in fresh cow diet. Well, this is relatively old, but this is a study done at South Dakota State University, and they fed lactose in place of starch during both close-up period and fresh period throughout calving transition. Then they found that butyrate concentration in the rumen increase, which makes sense because sugar ferments more to butyrate than propionate. Okay. Then as a consequence, plasma ketone or BHB increase for cows fed lactose. But what I found interesting is that they reported less fat deposition in the liver for cows fed lactose. Exact mechanism is not known or not discussed in that paper, but I think that feeding more lactose, which is means associated with feeding less starch during the close-up period, may cause less insulin resistance that may help less fat deposition in the liver. But we don't know. But it's a very interesting finding. Then their study, they did not report any difference in milk production. Okay. Another study that I like to show is that the study we conducted at University of Alberta 10 years ago. Then in this study, we used sucrose replacing part of dietary starch. Then we noted the greater dry matter intake, and also rumen pH was greater for cows fed sucrose. Okay? Then that was associated with greater milk fat production, tendency for greater milk fat production. So you may be wondering why feeding sugar increase lumen pH. Well, sugar is more fermentable than starch, so you may think that maybe feeding sugar causes more lumen acidosis by rapid fermentation. But replacing starch with sugars does not necessarily decrease lumen pH. In actually looking at the literature, several studies reported that feeding sugar in place of starch increase lumen pH. Then one of the speculation is that starch fermentation usually increase propionate production. So it means that one glucose, one hexose yields two propionic acids. Okay? So there are two protons produced from fermentation of one hexose. But when carbohydrate, like sugar, ferments to butyrate, one glucose yields one butyric acid. Then the other two carbon end up as a methane. Okay? So this increase less proton production. Okay? So because, I don't think this is everything, but this is one of the reasons or one of speculation why sugar fermentation compared with the starch fermentation may not really decrease lumen pH. Okay, so feeding sugar may be a good option for fresh cow management, and sugar is a very digestible, like 100%, almost 100% available, energy is available, but does not cause lumen acidosis, and often increase milk fat production. Then we may be able to use feedstuff high in sugar content in fresh cow management to effectively reduce starch content without negative consequence. So this is a summary for optimizing carbohydrate nutrition during a fresh period. Well, I can say that high starch diet do not necessarily increase milk yield of fresh cows, and sugars or highly digestible byproduct feed may be as effective as starch to maintain milk production. Okay, but I like you to note one thing that so energy status indicated by blood metabolite also sometimes shows some negative effect with low starch diet. Well, some research shows that feeding low starch diet increase NEFA concentration and decrease glucose concentration and body condition score without affecting milk production. So we may need to be aware of these consequences as well. Then I need to say that research data regarding fresh cow management are not very consistent in the literature. Then I think the part of discrepancy or inconsistency may be explained by different starch source in fresh cow diet, and also different cross-up management. So low starch cross-up diet may be better to go with low starch fresh diet, and high starch cross-up diet may go better with high starch fresh cow diet. Then I think the one other point I like to make is that we need to have some kind of adaptation period between dry cow and lactation diet. So, but I don't think it necessarily needs to be before calving, and there are some evidence that feeding advantage of feeding control low energy diet during a dry period, then if we choose to do so, I think we can introduce adaptation period after calving during a fresh period. Okay. Then now I like to change the subject. I like to talk about role of forage in fresh cow diet. Then first of all, I like to show the data from University of Saskatchewan. In this study, they use steer, and then they limit their intake to 25% of ad libitum intake for 5 days. This protocol kind of mimicking what we often see with dairy cow during a calving transition. If they experience some, metabolic disorders like DA or milk fever, their intake is reduced for several days. Then we need to think about how we help their recovery in dry matter intake. Then when they fed high forage diet, the intake recover, within 1 week. Okay, but when they fed low forage diet, after the restriction of dry matter intake, their intake did not recover fully until 3 weeks. Okay, so this data shows that maybe feeding high forage diet can help animal recover dry matter intake more quickly, after calving, and especially animal that experience metabolic disorders. Then the other thing I like to point out is that animal change their preference for feed when they experience acidosis. So this is the Penn State particle separator. Then usually the longest particle are sorted against by animal, so they tend to leave those long particles behind in the feed bank. But sick cows, there are some research data showing that sick cows or cows experiencing rumen acidosis prefer to consume long particles. Well, in this study from Penn State, the researcher prepared 2 TMR, similar in nutrient composition, but differ in particle size. So long TMR has 18% on the top screen. Then short TMR only 5% on the top screen. Then animal have free access to both TMR. Then they can choose whatever TMR they prefer. Then baseline period, animal prefer to eat TMR with short particle, which makes sense. But they induce rumen acidosis. Then they experimentally, then they found that their feed preference change. So more animal prefer long TMR, and this continue after 1 day after the acidosis challenge. Then 2 days after acidosis challenge, their feed preference change back to the baseline level. So this data shows that animal experiencing rumen acidosis may prefer long particle, although healthy cows tend to sort against those long particles. Well, another study proved the same concept. Okay, in this study, animals have access to both alfalfa hay and alfalfa pellet. So both has same NDF, same CP, so similar in nutrient composition. Difference is physical form. Okay, so blue color indicates healthy cows. Alfalfa hay, alfalfa pellet, or similar. Okay, but red color indicates feed preference of acidosis cows. They prefer alfalfa hay over alfalfa pellet. Okay, so I think this kind of change in feed preference occurs in animal. Okay, then I think we tend to experience something similar in human. For example, just for myself, I tend to enjoy like a glass of wine every night. But when I get sick, when I get flu, I didn't feel drinking wine anymore. Then I look for just simply water, warm water and milk instead of wine or beer. So I think, it's very common. It's not surprising for animals to change their feed preference when they get sick or when they experience rumen acidosis. So I think some dairy, feed top-dressed long hay in addition to TMR for fresh cows. Okay, I'm not trying to mean, I don't mean to encourage animals to, feed protein by feeding long hay, because if animals don't eat long hay, that's fine. They consume TMR that is optimally formulated to optimize their milk production. But only sick cows seek for long hay, then they can adjust their needs by feeding hay in addition to TMR. So this study shows the importance of physically effective forage fiber in fresh cow diet. But I like you to note one thing. Although physically effective fiber is important, I would not recommend feeding straw to fresh cows. The forage needs to be highly palatable and digestible one to maximize milk production. Well, in this study, the researcher fed wheat straw, just 4%, but they experienced great reduction in milk production, and also they experienced subclinical ketosis problem. Okay, so forage quality is important, even though animal needs physically effective fiber. So just summarizing, forage fiber, for fresh cows, feeding sufficient forage fiber is very important, and especially, when dry matter intake is reduced drastically, then acidosis cow change their feed preference, and feeding long hay would be nice in addition to TMR, but it should be digestible forage, not wheat straw. Okay, at the end, I like to just comment on other factors, non-dietary management factors affecting milk production. Well, even if we use a high-quality forage and optimally formulated diet, we cannot really maximize milk production because animal performance is also affected by feed management and bank management. Then this is a survey done in Spain about 10 years ago. They did survey 47 herds fed a common TMR. Then although they fed a similar TMR, their milk production vary from 21 to 34 kilo. Okay, then researcher asked many different questions, trying to identify factors associated with difference in milk production among the herds fed a common TMR. One of the questions that shows significant difference is that do they keep fresh cows separately from the rest of lactating cows? Then the farmer who said yes to this question, average milk production was significantly greater than farms said no to this question. Okay, then the other thing, other interesting finding is, do you provide enough feed to ensure some feed refusal next day? So it means that feed is available 24 hours a day. Well, when they say yes to that question, milk production was greater. Then push feed to ensure the feed is within the reach of cows. When they said yes to this question, milk production was almost 4 kilo greater per day. So these data indicate the importance of effort maximizing dry matter intake on farm. Okay, so in addition to diet formulation, in addition to use of high quality feedstuff, nutritional management is an important key for maximizing fresh cow management. Well, these two pictures I took at the two different dairy farms I visited recently. Well, obviously you see that a huge difference in bank management. Okay, but it's interesting that both dairymen said same thing. Well, look at my feed bank. My cow eat very well. Well, empty feed bank. Well, interpretation of dairy farmer is that cow eat everything, though they eat well. But on the right-hand side, well, the dairy producer trying to mean that he needs to feed this much to satisfy the appetite of the high-producing cows. So it's obvious that which management make great effort to maximize dry matter intake, and I found that it's interesting. So, so this is a summary. I think the point I want to make from this slide is that we need on-farm effort to maximize dry matter intake is essential for successful transition management. Okay. Okay. At the end, before I conclude my presentation, I'd like to make one point, how we monitor the success or failure of transition cow management. The point I want to make is that it's not milk production that tells failure or success. This is a study done at Wisconsin. Then they measure a body condition score change during a 3-week period after calving, maybe 4-week period after calving. Okay, so the animal who lost body condition score and actually who gained body condition score during a fresh period, milk yield did not differ, but their conception rate at first AI was different. Farm B, again, well, milk yield was similar. Well, regardless of change in body condition score, but conception rate at first AI was different. So my point is that maybe the change in body condition score during a fresh period is a good indicator telling us failure or success of transition cow management, and it is more informative than just looking at milk yield. So take-home message: if I were a dairy producer, I would probably prepare different TMR for fresh cows. Then it justifies us using more expensive feed stuff or more expensive feed additive, because animal would cost return on the cost would be greater for those selected animals. Then maybe I would choose one group dry cow management and feed control low energy diet before calving, but I would probably prepare different TMR low starch diet for fresh cows. But some dairy producer would prefer to feed one TMR for the whole lactating cows. Then in this situation, we need to consider some type of adaptation. Maybe, well, although some metabolic complications are expected, we may need to consider having some close-up period to adapt rumen and rumen micro. Or we may need to consider feeding long hay with TMR for fresh cows so that we can address the specific needs of fresh cows. Okay. With that, I'd like to thank my research sponsor, Alberta Milk, and I'd like to take any question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Oba. We do have several questions here. We're bumping up against the break here, but maybe touch on 2 or 3 of these here. The first one is, how does the rumen microbial communities change during the transition period, is the first part. Second part, do you see any significant changes based on low or high starch diets?
Okay, well, one of the change we see during the transition period in microbial profile is we have reduction in lactate utilizer, such as Megasphaera LCD9. Then if they disappear from the lumen or decrease substantially during the close-up period, then we switch diet to highly fermentable diet. Then we don't have microbe to metabolize lactate to volatile fatty acid. Then lactate tend to accumulate in the lumen. Then I think by having good adaptation, we can maintain some population of lactate utilizer so that we can microbe can deal with some change in diet fermentability. But we need to maintain good lactate utilizers throughout the dry period.
All right, thank you. One more here. Is there an opportunity to fine-tune diets even further in the pre- and postpartum diets based on source of starch, be it ruminally or post-ruminally, in regards to digestibility?
Yes, I think so. Then, as I presented, indicate in my presentation, like a dry ground corn, less fermentable or slowly fermentable grain would be a good starch source for fresh cows. But we don't have much data to say beyond that. I think this is the area that we need more research. But I think there is a lot of opportunity to fine-tune by looking at starch source in addition to how much starch we feed in a diet.
All right, thank you. Let's thank our speaker again.